The Last Haul, a vanishing that defied time. The year was 1984, a time of neon-lit highways, crackling CB radios, and the steady hum of diesel engines cutting through the American night. Truckers were the lifeblood of the nation, hauling freight across endless stretches of asphalt. Their stories whispered in diners and rest stops, but one driver's story would never reach its destination. His name was James Harlan, a man of routine, a man of few words, whose life was about to dissolve into one of the most chilling mysteries of the decade. James wasn't the kind of man who drew attention. He kept to himself, his logbook meticulous, his routes predictable. Yet, beneath the surface of his quiet existence, something darker was stirring. On the evening of October 12th, he loaded his rig with a shipment bound for Chicago, just another haul in a career spanning 2 decades. But this time, he never arrived. His truck was found abandoned at a desolate rest area, the engine still warm, the cab empty. No signs of struggle, no clues, just gone. For 20 years the case gathered dust in police files, a cold trail leading nowhere. Then, in 2004, a hidden logbook surfaced, tucked beneath the floorboard of James's old home, its pages filled with frantic scribbles, dates circled in red, and cryptic warnings. The final entry, written the night before his disappearance, read, "They're watching, not just me, the whole road." What or who had he seen, and why did it cost him his life? The answers lie buried in the shadows of that fateful night, where the line between routine and nightmare blurred. As we peel back the layers of this forgotten case, one question lingers: what happens when the road you trust becomes the one thing you can't escape? Stay with us, because the truth is darker than the longest stretch of highway. The morning of October 12th, 1984, began like any other for Harold Howe Whitmore. The air was thick with the scent of diesel, damp autumn leaves as he pulled his rig, a weathered but reliable Kenworth Coneworth 900, into the dimly lit parking lot of the Blue Ridge truck stop, just outside Asheville, North Carolina. The neon glow of the diner sign flickered against the pre-dawn darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than usual, as if reaching for something just beyond the edge of the pavement. Hal stepped down from the cab, his boots crunching gravel, the sound swallowed by the hum of idling engines and the distant murmur of CB radio chatter. He adjusted his cap, the brim worn soft from years of use, and rubbed the stubble on his jaw, a habit when he was thinking, though he wouldn't have admitted to being uneasy. Not yet. His routine was meticulous, a rhythm honed over 15 years on the road. Coffee first, black, 2 sugars. At the counter, where Marlene, the night shift waitress, already had a steaming mug waiting. She knew his order by heart, just as she knew the way his smile never quite reached his eyes when he talked about home. Their exchange was familiar, almost comforting. A few words about the weather, a joke about the latest country song playing on the jukebox, the clink of his spoon against the ceramic. But that morning, something lingered in the air between them. Marlene later told investigators she'd never seen Hal skip his usual second cup. He left half of it untouched, the surface of the coffee still rippling from the tremor in his hand. The logbook, in his glove compartment, told the story of a man who prided himself on precision. Every mile logged, every fuel stop recorded in his tight, sloping script. But in the days leading up to October 12th, the entries had grown increasingly erratic. Notes that didn't pertain to the route began to appear, fragmented, almost cryptic. Lights in the rear view, but no one there. CB silence at 2:17 a.m. Not even static. His dispatcher, Gary Holloway, dismissed it as fatigue when Hal called in the night before, his voice strained. "You're burning the candle at both ends, Hal. Take a breather." But Hal hadn't sounded tired. He'd sounded watched. By 5:47 a.m., he was back on I-40 East, hauling a load of textiles bound for Raleigh. The highway unspooled ahead of him, a ribbon of gray under a sky the color of bruises. His last transmission came at 6:23 a.m., a routine check-in with Gary. His voice was steady, almost too controlled. Copy that. ETA. Still on schedule. Over. Then nothing. No distress call. No skid marks on the pavement. No signs of struggle in the cab when his truck was found. Abandoned 12 hours later. Near a rest stop in Burlington. The engine still idling. The driver's seat warm. As if he'd simply stepped away. Yet the logbook told a different story. Tucked beneath the seat, hidden behind a loose panel, its final pages were filled with frantic scribbles, the ink smudged, as if written in haste. The last entry, time-stamped 6:45 a.m., read, "They're not following the truck. They're following me." The handwriting devolved into jagged strokes, the pen tearing the paper in places. And then, a single word, underlined so hard the nib broke through. Saul Whitmore was a man of habits, of routines so ingrained they were as natural as breathing. And on that October morning, something or someone had shattered his entirely. The question that would haunt his family for decades wasn't just where he had gone, but what had finally made him run. And as the sun rose higher, burning away the mist from the asphalt, the road behind him stayed empty, as if the earth itself had swallowed his answers whole. The clock struck midnight on October 12th, 1984, and James Harlan, known to his friends as Big Jim, was officially declared missing. His rig, a rust-red Kenworth with a faded eagle decal on the door, had been found abandoned at a desolate truck stop outside of Elko, Nevada. The engine still ticked faintly in the cold desert air, as if whispering the last echoes of a journey cut short. Inside, the cab was eerily pristine, no signs of struggle, no scattered belongings, just an empty thermos still warm to the touch, and a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in wax paper. But Jim? He had vanished without a trace. Co-workers at the freight company described Jim as quiet, but solid, a man who kept to himself, but never missed a deadline. One dispatcher, though, hesitated before admitting Jim had seemed off that last week, jumpy, like he was expecting something, or someone. When pressed, the man clammed up, his fingers nervously tapping a stained coffee cup. "Just a feeling," he muttered. But feelings, in a case like this, are the first threads of a noose. The media descended like vultures. Reporters camped outside the Harlan home, their camera lenses glinting in the autumn sun, as Margaret shielded her sons' faces with trembling hands. Headlines screamed of foul play, of truck stop robberies gone wrong, of shadowy figures seen lurking near the payphones. A waitress at the diner adjacent to the truck stop claimed she'd served Jim his usual black coffee, 2 sugars, just hours before he disappeared. He wasn't alone, she told a local news crew, her voice dropping to a hush. There was a man in a dark sedan watching him from the parking lot. Didn't order nothing, just watched. The sketch artist's rendering that followed was grainy, indistinct, a face that could belong to anyone or no one at all. Then, the whispers started. Rumors slithered through Elko like smoke. Some said Jim had been mixed up with the wrong crowd, that his routes through the Southwest had made him an unwitting mule for something far darker than freight. Others pointed to the logbook, still missing at the time, hinting at coded entries, at coordinates scribbled in the margins that didn't match any known delivery route. His oldest son, Tommy, would later confess to sneaking into his father's study, flipping through the pages of past logbooks, searching for clues. All he found were numbers that didn't add up, and a single phrase underlined in red: "They know about the back roads." 20 years of silence followed. 20 years of Margaret Harlan sitting by that same kitchen table, jumping at every phone ring, every knock on the door. 20 years of law enforcement files gathering dust, of leads turning to dead ends, of a community that slowly, reluctantly, learned to stop looking over their shoulders. But the question lingered, gnawing at the edges of every conversation, every quiet night in Elko. What happened to Big Jim? And more importantly, who didn't want him found? The answers, as it turned out, had been hiding in plain sight all along, buried in the one place no one thought to look. Until now. The investigation that vanished into thin air for 20 years. The case of the missing truck driver lingered like a shadow over the small town, an unsolved puzzle that refused to yield its secrets. The initial search had been frantic, with law enforcement scouring highways, rest stops, and abandoned warehouses. But as months turned into years, the trail grew colder, the leads more elusive. Yet, the investigation never truly stopped. It simply shifted. Detectives clung to every thread, no matter how frayed. They retraced his final known route, interviewing fellow truckers who had shared the road with him that night. One witness swore he saw the driver's rig parked near an old gas station, its engine idling, the cab empty. Another claimed to have spotted him at a roadside diner, scribbling furiously in a notebook, later confirmed to be the logbook that would become the case's most chilling artifact. But the accounts conflicted, timelines blurred, and the few clues they gathered only deepened the mystery. Forensic teams combed the truck when it was found, abandoned weeks later. Fingerprints were lifted, fibers analyzed, yet nothing pointed to foul play, just an eerie absence of struggle. The driver's personal effects remained untouched, his wallet still in the glove compartment, his thermos half full of cold coffee. Even the CB radio, usually buzzing with chatter, had fallen silent mid-transmission, as if he had simply stepped away. Theories swirled like dust in the wind. Some whispered of a secret life, a double existence that had finally caught up with him. Others pointed to the logbook's cryptic entries, frantic notes about being followed, strange lights in the rearview mirror, a name scribbled in the margins that no one recognized. A local mechanic insisted the truck's brakes had been tampered with, but the report vanished from the files. Then there were the rumors, dark tales of a rival trucking company with ties to organized crime, of a driver who knew too much and paid the price. Yet, for all the speculation, the case remained frozen in time. Detectives retired, witnesses moved on, and the file gathered dust in a forgotten corner of the precinct. But the questions never faded. Why had he stopped writing mid-sentence? Who or what had he been afraid of? And why, after 2 decades of silence, did the truth still feel just out of reach? Perhaps the answers were never meant to be found, or perhaps they were hidden in plain sight all along. The logbook waits. The road remembers, and somewhere, in the quiet hum of a highway at night, the past is still whispering. The years stretched on, like an endless highway, under a moonless sky, each one swallowing the last, in a silence so thick it felt like the world itself had forgotten. By the turn of the millennium, the case of the vanished truck driver had settled into the quiet corners of memory, no longer a screaming headline, but a whisper passed between old-timers at the diner, a cautionary tale spun over flickering porch lights. The files gathered dust in the sheriff's office, their edges yellowed with time. The urgency of the search long since faded into bureaucratic indifference. Yet, for those who had loved him, the absence was anything but silent. It was a scream trapped in the throat, a shadow that stretched longer with every birthday uncelebrated, every holiday chair left empty. Life, as it does, moved forward. The truck stop, where he'd last fueled up, changed hands twice, its neon sign flickering into obsolescence before being replaced by cold LED lights. The waitress who'd served him his final cup of coffee retired, her memories of that night blurring at the edges like an old Polaroid. The detectives who'd once pored over maps and timelines were promoted, transferred, or retired, their replacements too young to remember the name that had once sent a chill through the department. Even the highway he'd driven had been repaved, its cracks filled in, its shoulders widened, as if the earth itself was trying to erase the path he'd taken into the unknown. But in the quiet house on the edge of town, time had not been so kind. His wife still set a place for him at the table on Sundays, her hands trembling as she traced the rim of his untouched coffee mug. His children, now grown, carried the weight of his disappearance in the way they flinched at the sound of a diesel engine idling in the night, or how they avoided the stretch of interstate where he'd vanished. Hope had curdled into something darker, something that clung like the scent of diesel in fabric, impossible to wash out, impossible to ignore. They spoke of him in hushed tones, as if mentioning his name too loudly might summon the ghost of what had been left unresolved. The town, too, had its rituals. Every October, when the air turned crisp and the fields lay fallow, someone would leave a single lit candle on the guardrail at the last known exit he'd taken. No one admitted to doing it, but the candle always appeared, its flame guttering in the wind like a silent prayer. The locals called it the Phantom Hall, a story told to new drivers passing through, a warning, a legend, a way to keep the memory alive, even as the truth slipped further into the dark. Some swore they'd seen his rig in the dead of night, a phantom semi rolling down the highway with no one at the wheel, its headlights cutting through the fog like the eyes of the lost. And then, just when the world had nearly convinced itself that some mysteries were meant to stay buried, a single discovery would shatter the stillness. Because the past, no matter how deeply it's buried, has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. And this time, it would bring with it the voice of a man who had been silent for 20 years. The silence that had smothered the case for 20 years was about to be shattered, not by a scream, not by a confession, but by the quiet rustle of yellowed pages tucked beneath the floorboards of an abandoned truck stop diner. It began with a renovation, a routine demolition of the old Blue Star Cafe, a place where the missing driver, Harold Voss, had last been seen sipping black coffee before vanishing into the night. Workers pried up the warped wooden planks, expecting nothing more than dust and decay. But there, wedged between the joists, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with frayed twine, lay a logbook, his logbook. The moment the first investigator flipped it open, the air in that room grew thick with something electric, something alive. The case wasn't cold anymore. It was burning. The pages were filled with Harold's tight, sloping script, the ink faded but still legible. Each entry, a breadcrumb left behind by a man who seemed to know he was walking toward an edge. The dates aligned perfectly with the final days before his disappearance. The margins scrawled with notes that weren't just records of mileage or fuel stops. They were fragments of a mind unraveling. Investigators' hands trembled as they turned the pages, the weight of what they held pressing down on them. This wasn't just evidence. It was a voice, whispering from the grave. Harold had been writing in code, in urgency, in fear, and now, 2 decades later, he was finally ready to speak. The family was called in, under the cover of dusk, the kind of twilight that feels like the world is holding its breath. His daughter, now a woman with her own children, traced her fingers over the entries, as if she could pull him back through the ink. The detectives watched her face shift, from disbelief to dawning horror, as she realized her father hadn't just vanished. He had tried to warn them. The logbook wasn't a diary. It was a trail of clues, a map leading straight into the heart of whatever had taken him. And as the first entries were read aloud, a chill settled over the room, because Harold hadn't just documented his route, he had documented his terror. The question now wasn't whether they'd solve the mystery, it was whether they were ready for the answers. Because some truths don't just explain the past, they rewrite it. And Harold's logbook wasn't just going to tell them what happened to him. It was going to force them to confront what had been hiding in plain sight all along. The logbook lay open before them, its yellowed pages brittle with time, each entry a whisper from the past, fragments of a mind unraveling under the weight of something unseen. Investigators traced their fingers over the ink, the driver's handwriting shifting from steady and methodical in the early entries to jagged, frantic scribbles in the final days. It wasn't just a record of miles driven or fuel stops. It was a confession, a cry for help buried beneath the mundane details of a trucker's life. And as they read, the air in the room grew heavier, the words pulling them into the driver's spiraling descent. The first signs of unease appeared 3 days before his disappearance. "Something's following me," he wrote in the margin of a fuel receipt. The letters pressed so hard they tore the paper. Not a truck, not a car, just headlights in the distance. Always the same distance behind. Never closer, never gone. The entry was dated midnight, the kind of hour when exhaustion blurs the line between reality and the shadows that dance at the edges of the road. But this wasn't fatigue speaking. The next night, his words took on a desperate clarity. "I cut through the back roads to lose it. Took the old highway near Black Ridge. No one uses that road." But the lights were still there, waiting. The investigators exchanged glances. Black Ridge was a stretch of abandoned pavement, a place where cell service died and the trees pressed in too close. The kind of place where a man could vanish without a trace dot. By the final entry, his handwriting was nearly illegible, the ink smeared as if written in haste or fear. "They know my route. They know my stops. I don't know how, but they do. I can't tell anyone. No one would believe me. Maybe I don't believe me." The words trailed off into a sketch, a crude drawing of a semi-truck with a single word scrawled beneath it. Wrong, or something far more sinister. The page was torn at the corner, as if he'd hesitated before committing the thought to paper, as if even the act of writing it down made it too real. The most chilling detail wasn't the paranoia. It was the precision. He'd noted times, locations, even weather conditions, with meticulous care, as if compiling evidence for a case only he could see. Rain started at 2:17 a.m. The lights don't flicker in the rain. They just stay. The logbook didn't just document his fear. It mapped the methodical stalking of a man who knew he was being hunted. And yet, in the margins of his final entry, amid the chaos of his thoughts, there was a single haunting question. What do they want? The room fell silent as the last page was turned. The logbook didn't answer the question. It only deepened the abyss, because if he was being followed, who were they, and why had they let him write it all down, before ensuring he'd never speak of it again? The answers, if they existed, were still out there, hidden in the stretch of highway where the headlights never flickered, where the rain fell without mercy, and where a trucker's last words echoed like a warning no one heeded in time. Now close your eyes and imagine it. The hum of the engine, the endless road ahead, and the unshakable feeling that you are not alone. What would you do when the only thing following you is the thing you can't outrun? The logbook wasn't just a record. It was a confession written in the language of fear. Each entry, scribbled in frantic handwriting, reveals a man unraveling under the weight of something far darker than exhaustion. The dates blur into a timeline of paranoia, where routine stops become encounters with shadows, and the open road transforms into a labyrinth of unseen threats. He writes of a figure, always just out of sight, a man in a dark sedan who appeared at 3 different truck stops, never speaking, only watching. The driver's notes grow increasingly erratic. "He knows my route. He's waiting." Then the final entry, barely legible. "They're not just following me. They're inside my head." But who were they? The logbook hints at more than one presence. A mechanic in Oklahoma, mentioned twice, who insisted on inspecting his rig for free, despite the driver's refusal. A waitress in New Mexico, who slipped him a note with a single word, "Run." And then there's the most chilling detail, a series of coordinates, scribbled in the margins, leading to an abandoned rest stop where another trucker had vanished a year prior. Was this a warning, or was he being lured into something far more sinister? The psychological toll is undeniable. His writing shifts from professional detachment to raw terror, as if he's arguing with himself. One moment convinced he's being hunted, the next questioning his own sanity. Maybe it's the sleep deprivation. Maybe I'm losing it. But the dates don't lie. The entries grow more desperate, the handwriting more jagged, until the final page trails off mid-sentence, as if he was interrupted, or worse, as if he finally understood what was coming for him. Now, consider this. If you were alone on a deserted highway at 3 a.m., your radio dead, your mirrors showing nothing but darkness, would you keep driving? Or would you pull over, heart pounding, convinced that the headlights behind you weren't just another truck? The logbook forces us to ask, what would you do when fear and survival collide? Because for this driver, that choice may have been the difference between vanishing and being found. And as the investigation reopens, one question lingers. Were these notes the ravings of a broken mind, or the last clues left by a man who knew too much? The logbook didn't just whisper secrets, it screamed them. And when its yellowed pages finally landed on Detective Carl Mercer's desk in 2004, the case of the vanished trucker, Richard Voss, cracked open like a fault line. Mercer had been a rookie patrol officer when Voss disappeared, but 2 decades later, with the weight of a cold case unit behind him, he stared at those frantic scribbles and felt the past reach out with icy fingers. The notes weren't just a record of miles driven or fuel stops. They were a map of fear. Names, partially obscured, times that didn't align with dispatch logs, and one recurring phrase, underlined so hard the pen tore the paper. They know the route. The investigation reignited with an urgency that bordered on desperation. Mercer's team cross-referenced every name in the logbook. Some were fellow drivers, others strangers. Voss had met at truck stops along I-80, but it was the interviews that chilled them. Take Mary Ellen Hayes, a diner waitress in Cheyenne, who'd served Voss his last meal. She remembered him now, all these years later, because of the way he'd gripped her wrist when she refilled his coffee. He didn't ask for the check, she told Mercer, her voice trembling. He asked if I'd ever heard of a man called the dispatcher. Not a job, a name. The logbook had it too, scrawled in the margin beside a date, 2 days before he vanished. Dispatcher called, said the load was special. No paperwork. Then there was Earl Dawson, a retired mechanic, from a now-defunct garage outside Reno. He'd been the last to see Voss's rig before it disappeared. Earl didn't just recall the truck. He remembered the silence. Rich usually joked around, but that night, he just stared at the road like it was a noose, kept muttering about wrong turns and people who don't show up on maps. Earl's hands shook as he pulled an old invoice from his pocket, one that didn't match the company records. The date, the night Voss vanished. The signature, not his. Mercer's team traced the special load to a defunct shipping company, but the records had been purged, except for one anomaly. A single manifest, filed under a false company name, listed a delivery to a warehouse that had burned down in 1985. Arson, the report said. No suspects, no motives, just ashes. And yet, when Mercer drove to the site, he found something the fire hadn't taken. A rusted padlock, half buried in the dirt. Engraved on its back were 2 letters, DV. The pieces were there, scattered like breadcrumbs in a forest of lies. But the deeper Mercer dug, the more the question gnawed at him. What kind of truth stays hidden for 20 years? And what happens when it finally decides to surface? The logbook had been a spark, but now the fire was spreading. And somewhere in the smoke, the answer to Richard Voss's fate was waiting, just out of reach, just beyond the next turn. The case file landed on Detective Elias Voss's desk, like a ghost from the past, yellowed pages, faded ink, and the weight of a mystery that had haunted a town for 20 years. Most would have dismissed it as another cold case, another name lost to time. But not Voss. There was something in the truck driver's logbook, something in the frantic scribbles of the final entries, that clawed at him. The words weren't just notes. They were a plea, a trail of breadcrumbs, left by a man who knew he was being watched. Voss wasn't assigned to the case. He took it. Late nights in the archives, tracing the driver's last known route, interviewing retired dispatchers who still remembered the eerie silence after his final transmission. He mapped the logbook's cryptic references, Mentions of a shadow rig tailing him, a rest stop where the air felt wrong, a name half erased in the margins. Marlowe. No one else saw the pattern, but Voss did. The driver hadn't just vanished. He'd been taken. His methods were unorthodox. He drove the same stretch of highway at the exact times recorded in the logbook, feeling the isolation, the way the headlights cut through the dark like knives. He tracked down the waitress at the diner where the driver last ate, her hands shaking as she recalled how he'd left his coffee untouched, his eyes darting toward the door. He wasn't scared of the road, she whispered. He was scared of what was on it. The deeper Voss dug, the more the case dug into him. His apartment became a shrine to the investigation. Photos, maps, red string, connecting names and dates. His captain warned him to step back. His ex-wife begged him to sleep. But the logbook's final entry haunted his dreams. They're not just watching, they're waiting. And then a breakthrough. A retired mechanic remembered a truck matching the shadow rig description, always parked just out of sight at the same stops. Its license plate, registered to a shell company, linked to a man named Darius Marlowe. The pieces were falling into place, but as Voss stood in the dim light of his office, staring at the name scrawled across his whiteboard, he realized the truth wasn't just about solving a disappearance. It was about confronting something far darker, because if the driver's last words were a warning, then what was coming for him? The case had grown cold, a ghost haunting the files of every investigator who dared revisit it, until the letter arrived. It was postmarked from a town 3 states away, the handwriting shaky, the words barely legible, but the message unmistakable. I saw something that night, something they made me forget. The sender, a retired waitress from a roadside diner along the driver's last known route, had carried the burden of her silence for decades. But now, with her health failing and her conscience gnawing, she had finally broken her vow. And with that single confession, the entire investigation fractured open. Detective Marcus Hale, the man who had spent years chasing shadows in this case, felt the ground shift beneath him as he read her statement. The waitress described a truck, matching the missing driver's rig, parked behind the diner in the early hours of his disappearance. But it wasn't the vehicle that sent a chill down Hale's spine. It was the second truck idling beside it, its cab dark, its presence unrecorded in any log. Worse still, she remembered voices, harsh, urgent, and a name spoken in warning. Tell them Vesper sent you. No records existed of a Vesper in the trucking company's files. No employee, no client, no trace. Yet there it was, a name that had slipped through the cracks for 20 years, now dangling like a noose over everything they thought they knew. The family, who had long since buried their hope beneath layers of grief, found themselves unsteady in the storm of this revelation. The driver's daughter, now a woman in her 40s, clutched the photocopy of the waitress's letter as if it might dissolve in her hands. Her mother, frail but sharp-eyed, traced the words with a trembling finger, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't just vanish. Someone took him. The weight of that truth settled over them like a shroud, relief that the unknown might finally be uncovered, terror at what that uncovering might demand of them. Meanwhile, the town that had whispered about the case for decades now buzzed with a different kind of energy. The diner became a pilgrimage site for true crime enthusiasts and reporters, its booths filled with voices dissecting theories, its walls suddenly heavy with the ghosts of 1984. But beneath the speculation lay a darker current. If Vesper was real, if this was more than a lone driver's misfortune, then the rot ran deeper than anyone had dared imagine. And Hale knew, with a certainty that coiled in his gut, that they were no longer hunting for a missing man. They were hunting for a predator who had walked free for 20 years. The logbook had been the first key. Now the waitress's letter was the second. But doors like these didn't open without a cost. As Hale stared at the name Vesper, scrawled in his notebook, he could feel the case tightening around him, a snare waiting to snap shut. The truth was coming. And with it, the reckoning dot. The moment the logbook's yellowed pages were laid bare beneath the forensic lamp, time itself seemed to fracture for the Miller family. 20 years of silence, of birthdays marked by absence, of holidays where an empty chair loomed larger than any feast, now trembled on the edge of revelation. The air in their modest living room grew thick, not with the dust of forgotten years, but with the electric charge of something far more dangerous, the possibility of knowing. For 2 decades, they had oscillated between grief and a quiet, gnawing suspicion that the truth had been buried alongside Richard Miller's truck. But now, as his final scribbled notes stared back at them, frantic, cryptic, alive, the family found themselves suspended in a terrible limbo. Was this the answer they'd prayed for, or the confirmation of a nightmare they'd barely allowed themselves to imagine? His daughter, Claire, traced a finger over the dated entries, her breath shallow. The ink had faded, but the urgency in the words had not. They're watching the roots. Not just me, others too. The words were a knife twist, at once validating her father's paranoia in those last frantic phone calls and unspooling a new horror. If he had been right, if he had uncovered something dangerous enough to erase him, what did that mean for the family now? Her mother, Eleanor, clutched the armrest of her chair until her knuckles bleached white. She had spent years constructing a fragile peace, telling herself that Richard had simply vanished. A tragic accident, a wrong turn into the vast, indifferent dark. But these pages didn't speak of accidents. They whispered of intent, and intent meant someone had chosen this. Someone had taken him. The detectives warned them, prepared them, as much as one could be prepared, for the unraveling of a lie they'd lived with for half their lives. This changes everything, the lead investigator had said, his voice low, his eyes flicking to the logbook like it was a live grenade. And it did. The case, once cold, now pulsed with a sickly heat. The trucking company's old records were being exhumed. Former colleagues, long retired, were being tracked down, their memories prodded like bruises. But for the Millers, the shift was more visceral. Hope was a betrayal now, a traitorous glimmer that dared to suggest this pain might mean something. That Richard hadn't just been stolen from them, but that his disappearance had been a piece of something larger, something solvable. Yet beneath that hope coiled the older, deeper fear. What if the truth was worse than the not knowing? What if the logbook's final, smudged entry, "Meet at the old depot, midnight," wasn't a clue, but a death sentence? Claire's younger brother, Jake, voiced what none of them would say aloud. What if we find him, and it's not the way we remembered? The words hung there, poisonous, because they all knew. The man in their memories, the one who tossed them into the air as kids, who smelled of diesel and butterscotch candy, was frozen in amber. But the man in that logbook, he was afraid, he was hunted, and if they followed his trail to its end, they might not like what waited for them in the dark. The house that night was a tomb of whispered what-ifs. Eleanor stared at the family photo on the mantel, Richard's arms slung around her shoulders, his grin so wide it seemed to mock her. "You thought you knew me," it said, "but you didn't." The detectives would return at dawn, with more questions, more leads, more pieces of a puzzle that might finally take shape. But as the clock ticked toward morning, the Millers sat in the dim glow of a single lamp, united and shattered by the same terrible thought. The truth was coming, and nothing would be the same after. Not their grief, not their memories, not even the man they'd spent 20 years mourning. So tell me, when the past reaches out with answers you've begged for, do you take its hand? Or do you let the dead keep their secrets, knowing some doors once opened can never be closed again? The night air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and old secrets as Detective Elias Mercer stood beneath the flickering glow of a street lamp, the logbook's brittle pages trembling in his grip. The ink, faded yet unmistakable, had already revealed too much. And now, the threads of the past were pulling him deeper into a labyrinth where every shadow seemed to whisper warnings. The names scribbled in the margins weren't just leads, they were ghosts, each one tied to a network of silence that had held firm for 20 years. But silence, Mercer knew, was just another kind of lie, and lies had a way of unraveling when you tugged hard enough. The first threat came, not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a black sedan idling at the curb outside his motel room. He'd seen it earlier that evening, parked too close to the diner, where he'd questioned a retired dispatcher whose hands had shaken around her coffee cup. Now, as he stepped into the dimly lit parking lot, the engine purred to life, headlights slicing through the dark like a blade. Mercer didn't run. He stood his ground, watching as the car inched forward, close enough for him to see the driver's face, obscured by the brim of a hat, close enough to feel the weight of a stare that wasn't just curious, it was a promise. The sedan rolled past, slow and deliberate, before vanishing around the corner, leaving behind the acrid tang of exhaust and the cold certainty that someone was watching, waiting. Back in his room, Mercer spread the logbook across the bed, its pages a mosaic of dates, coordinates, and cryptic notes that now pulsed with urgency. One entry, scrawled in what looked like haste, stood out. They know about the drop at Miller's Ridge. If they find the ledger, we're all finished. The ledger, not just a record of hauls, but something else, something worth killing for. His fingers traced the words as his mind raced. Miller's Ridge was an abandoned way station, 30 miles out, a place where the highway bent like a broken spine. It was also where another trucker had vanished in '79. His rig found empty, the cab wiped clean. Coincidence? Mercer didn't believe in those anymore. By dawn, he was on the road, the sedan's phantom presence lingering in his rear view. The way station loomed ahead, a skeletal relic of rusted metal and shattered glass. The air here was different, heavier, as if the land itself remembered what had happened. Mercer's boots crunched over gravel as he approached the old office, its door hanging crooked on its hinges. Inside, the stench of mildew and something fouler clogged his throat. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, landing on a loose floorboard near the back. Heart-hammering, he pried it open. Beneath it lay a waterlogged box, its contents wrapped in oilcloth. The ledger, but the triumph was short-lived. A twig snapped outside. Mercer froze, his breath shallow. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circled the building. He killed the flashlight, plunging himself into darkness as the doorknob turned. The beam of another light swept the room, pausing over the open floorboard. A voice, low and gravelly, broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come here, detective." The ledger suddenly felt like a live grenade in his hands. Mercer's mind raced. He could fight. He could run. Or he could do the one thing they wouldn't expect. Stare into the darkness and ask the question that had haunted this case from the start. Why? The word hung between them, a challenge and a confession, all at once. The silence that followed was worse than any threat, because in that moment, Mercer realized the truth wasn't just buried in the ledger or the logbook. It was standing right in front of him, breathing the same stale air, carrying the same weight of 20 years of lies. And the real question wasn't why the trucker had vanished. It was why anyone had ever thought he'd gone alone. Now, as the first light of dawn creeps over Miller's Ridge, we're left to wonder, how far would you go to uncover the truth? And what would you do if once you found it, the truth stared back at you with eyes you recognized? The ledger is open. The past is speaking. But are we ready to listen? The night air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and diesel fumes as Detective Mercer stood beneath the flickering glow of a lone street lamp, the logbook's final pages trembling in his grip. The weight of 20 years of silence pressed down on him, not just the absence of answers, but the eerie precision of the driver's last entries. Each line was a breadcrumb, meticulously placed, as if James Holloway had known his fate was hurtling toward him like a runaway rig on black ice. And now, the final piece had slipped into place. The confrontation came not in a back alley standoff or a dramatic interrogation, but in the quiet horror of a name scrawled in the margins. They know about the shipment, not the cargo, the other one. The words were underlined twice, the ink smudged as if written in haste, the pen pressing too hard into the paper. Mercer's pulse hammered against his ribs. The other shipment wasn't on any manifest. It wasn't in the company records, but it was in the half-burned receipts found tucked behind the logbook's back cover. Receipts for a storage unit, paid in cash, under a name that didn't belong to Holloway, a name that belonged to his dispatcher, Richard Voss. The pieces locked together with a sickening click. Voss hadn't just been covering for Holloway's disappearances, he'd been orchestrating them. The routine haul that night in '84 wasn't a delivery, it was a pickup. And Holloway, ever the meticulous recorder, had documented the coordinates in code, buried between notes about tire pressure and fuel stops. Mercer's fingers traced the numbers now, his breath shallow. The location wasn't a truck stop. It was an abandoned airstrip, 40 miles outside of town. A place where, according to old flight logs, small planes had made unscheduled landings in the dead of night. Planes registered to a shell company, linked to Voss's brother Law. But the revelation that gutted Mercer wasn't the conspiracy, it was the last entry, dated the night Holloway vanished. If you're reading this, I didn't make it out, but I couldn't let it go. Not after what I saw in the crates. They weren't just moving goods, they were moving people. The words blurred as Mercer's vision darkened at the edges. This wasn't about smuggling. It wasn't about money. It was about lives, stolen, traded, erased. And Holloway, a man who'd spent his life on the road, seeing the underbelly of the world from his cab, had tried to stop it. The detective's hands shook as he flipped back to the first page, where a single phrase was circled in red. The road doesn't lie. Holloway had left them a map, not to his body, to the truth. And now, Mercer stood at the crossroads of justice and oblivion, knowing that some secrets weren't just buried, they were guarded. The question wasn't whether he'd follow the trail to its end. It was whether he'd survive what waited for him there. What would you do if you held the key to a truth that could shatter lives or save them? Would you turn away, or would you step into the darkness, knowing some lights aren't meant to be found? The truth, once buried beneath decades of silence, now lay exposed, raw and unrelenting. The logbook's final entries had spoken in whispers of desperation, each word a ghostly echo of the driver's last days. But what followed was not the quiet closure families often pray for. Instead, it was a storm of emotions, crashing over those who had waited, those who had searched, and those who had long since given up hope. For the driver's family, the revelation was a blade twisting in an old wound. His wife, her hands trembling as she traced the faded ink of his final notes, found herself caught between grief and fury. The answers she had begged for were there, yet they brought no peace. How does one mourn a man twice? First as missing, then as a victim of circumstances darker than any had imagined. Their children, now adults with lives of their own, stood in stunned silence, their childhood memories of a father who vanished into the night, now tainted by the harsh light of truth. One daughter clutched an old photograph, her fingers pressing into the edges as if she could reach through time and pull him back. The other turned away, his jaw set, because some truths are too heavy to carry without anger. The community, too, was shaken. The truck stop where he had last been seen, a place of passing hellos and forgotten faces, became a shrine of whispered apologies. Regulars who had known him, shared coffee with him, laughed over road stories, now stared at their hands, wondering if they had missed the signs. Had his smile been too tight, his jokes too forced? Guilt settled like dust over the town, because in hindsight, everything looked different. The investigators, men and women who had chased dead ends for years, felt the weight of what they had uncovered. One detective, a veteran who had worked the case from the beginning, sat in his car long after the press conference ended, his breath fogging the glass. He had solved it, and yet the victory tasted like ash. Relief came in fleeting moments, tangled with sorrow. There would be no more wondering, no more false leads or hopeful tips that led to nothing. But the cost of that certainty was the knowledge of how he had suffered, how he had tried to leave a trail, how close he had come to being heard. The logbook's pages, now sealed in evidence bags, seemed to hum with his voice, a final plea that had taken 20 years to answer. And so, the story did not end with the truth. It lingered, like the after-image of headlights in a rear-view mirror, because some questions, once answered, only lead to deeper ones. What do we owe the lost? How do we live with the weight of what we couldn't see? The road stretches on, and so does the silence, broken only by the echoes of those who vanish, and those left behind to listen. The logbook's final entry still lingers in the air, like the scent of old paper and diesel fumes, words written in haste, ink smudged by trembling fingers, a man unraveling under the weight of something unseen. But long after the investigators closed their files and the headlines faded, the ones left behind carried the heaviest burden of all: the quiet. For 20 years, the family of Daniel Mercer lived in the hollow space between hope and acceptance, where grief is not a single moment, but a landscape they learned to navigate, one careful step at a time. His wife, Eleanor, kept his favorite flannel shirt hanging in the closet, the fabric still holding the faintest trace of his cologne, the ghost of the man who once filled their home with laughter and the rhythmic hum of truckers' tales. She would press it to her face on nights when the silence in the house grew too loud, as if the threads themselves could whisper what his voice no longer could. Their daughter, Claire, now grown, found herself tracing the routes her father used to drive on old road maps, her fingers pausing over the stretch of highway where his trail went cold. She wondered if the asphalt remembered him, if the wind still carried the echo of his CB radio crackling into the void. The logbook's discovery did not bring the closure they expected. Instead, it opened a door to a room they hadn't known existed, one filled with questions sharper than answers. Why had he written of shadows that moved when the headlights weren't on? What did he mean when he scribbled, "They don't want me to see where this road really goes"? The truth, when it finally surfaced, was not a neat resolution, but a fractured mirror, reflecting back pieces of a man they thought they knew. Daniel had been carrying secrets. Yes, but weren't we all? The real horror wasn't in the unknown. It was in realizing how little we ever truly see of those we love, even when they're right beside us. Now, the family gathers at the edge of the same highway where Daniel vanished, not to mourn, but to release. Eleanor scatters a handful of earth from their old garden, the soil he once tilled with calloused hands, into the wind. Claire plays a recording of his voice, recovered from an old answering machine, the static wrapping around his words like a shroud. "I'll be home by dawn. Keep the light on." They do not weep. They stand, shoulders brushed by the same breeze that once rushed past his rig, and they breathe. The road stretches endlessly before them, a ribbon of asphalt swallowing the horizon. Somewhere, beyond the curve where the headlights fail, the truth still waits, but so does life. And here is where the story leaves them, and leaves you. How many unseen burdens do the people you love carry in silence? How many roads have they traveled that you'll never know? The mystery of Daniel Mercer isn't just about a man who vanished. It's about the fragile threads that connect us all, the unspoken fears we tuck away, the ways we disappear from each other long before we're truly gone. Tonight, reach out. Ask the questions you've been too afraid to voice. Listen, not just to the answers, but to the spaces between them. Because in the end, the only thing more terrifying than the unknown is the thought that we might have looked, but never truly seen. The light is still on. Don't let it burn in vain.